The night always carried a hush in that household, a hush broken not by storms or quarrels, but by the faint murmurs of ordinary restlessness. The family, though together under one roof, often drifted in their own directions like small boats tethered to a pier, close, yet never quite colliding. The air was full of sighs left unspoken, of questions never fully asked. In that quiet unrest, Rick, the old wanderer of the family, brought forth a box. It was not just any box. It glowed softly as though lit from within, a lantern-like gleam that never flickered, never dimmed. Strange objects were not unusual when Rick was around, but this one seemed different, quieter, less of a tool for wild invention and more of a whisper from another world. He placed it on the table with the same casualness someone else might place a loaf of bread, though his eyes for just a moment betrayed something gentler, a flicker of anticipation, perhaps even care. When the box opened, what emerged was not mechanical nor monstrous. It was luminous and strange, yet friendly in form, a creature of blue light, smiling as if its entire being was woven from patience. Its voice was soft, echoing like a stone dropped in a still lake. "I am here to help," it said, not as command but as lullaby. The family leaned closer. At first with suspicion, then with a childlike wonder none of them had felt in years. The creature bowed its head, awaiting a request. It explained its purpose gently. It would exist only until it fulfilled a task. To help was its beginning and its end, its reason and its release. This was the strange beginning. Not a battle, not a shout, but a glow in the dim corners of a restless home. A family, fractured in little ways, was suddenly confronted with something both simple and profound, a being who wanted nothing but to serve. And yet, in its patient eyes, there lingered something deeper, as though even in kindness there was fragility, a quiet sorrow tied to the fleeting nature of its life. Rick, half smiling, half hiding his smile, leaned back in his chair. "They're called Meeseeks," he murmured, his voice gravelly but softened by the dim glow. "You ask, they help, they disappear, no mess, no fuss." But beneath his gruff tone lay something more, the unspoken truth that he wasn't just showing them a tool. He was, in his own way, offering a gift, a chance for his family to touch a wonder not bound by ordinary time. The room grew quieter still. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed louder, the ticking of a forgotten clock on the wall more distinct. The Meeseeks stood in patient silence, waiting, smiling, shimmering. The lantern light glow from its body touched the faces of those present, painting them in hues of gentle blue. No one spoke at first. Perhaps they were unsure. Perhaps they were simply caught in the strangeness of it, the gentle, surreal truth that something so extraordinary could stand so calmly in their living room. It was Morty, wide-eyed, who finally leaned forward, his small hands gripping the edge of the table as though afraid the glow might slip away. "What happens when it's done helping?" he asked softly, his voice a mixture of curiosity and something more fragile, hope, maybe. The Meeseek's eyes met his, kind and clear. "Then I am free," it whispered, "and freedom is the peace of ending." Morty's heart trembled at the words. He didn't fully understand, not yet, but something about them clung to him. The idea that even in endings there could be gentleness, even in disappearance there could be release. He felt it like a lullaby, like a truth too soft to grasp but too beautiful to forget. Rick grunted, dismissing the heaviness with a wave of his hand. "Don't overthink it, Morty. They're tools. You ask, they do, they're gone. Simple as that." Yet his eyes lingered on his grandson a moment longer than usual, as though silently recognizing the weight those words had carried. The family shifted again, restless, uncertain. The Meeseeks remained, glowing patiently, waiting for its first call. Jerry, Morty's father, fidgeted in his chair, unsure whether to laugh, to believe, or to walk away. Beth, Morty's mother, crossed her arms, hiding both her skepticism and her fascination. Summer, Morty's sister, rolled her eyes, though even she could not resist glancing back at the glow, her gaze softening in spite of herself. And Morty. Morty simply stared, his heart caught somewhere between wonder and longing. That night stretched slowly. The house held its breath, the family orbiting around the glow of the Meeseeks as though it were a fire in the middle of a cold camp. No one knew yet what they would ask. No one knew yet how much would unfold from a simple box on the table. But the moment was already shifting them, already tilting their lives gently in a new direction. For in that house where silence had often meant distance, there was suddenly a different kind of silence, one born of awe, of curiosity, of a mystery not meant to frighten, but to soften. Faux silence in which even the weary heart could rest a little easier. And so the strange beginning was not a clash of worlds, but a glow, a smile, a voice saying, "I am here to help." It was the beginning of a journey that none of them yet understood. A journey not of grand battles, but of quiet lessons. A journey that would unfold in whispers, in patience, in laughter, in sorrow, and in release. And somewhere in the stillness of that night, while the Meeseeks waited and the family wondered, Morty felt something stir inside him, a longing not just for answers, but for a path of his own. It was, as it often is in life, the softest of beginnings. The morning that followed did not arrive with alarm clocks or hurried footsteps, but with a strange, soft quiet. The Meeseeks remained, glowing in the corner of the living room, as though time itself respected its patience. It did not shift, did not fidget, did not demand. It simply waited, a blue flame without smoke, a lantern that breathed but did not burn. Jerry was the first to stir. He tiptoed past as though walking near a sleeping child. The Meeseeks turned, its head slowly smiling with an expression that was both familiar and unfamiliar. It wasn't human, but its gaze carried the warmth of someone who had known him all his life. Jerry stammered a good morning, though it felt silly to greet such a being. The Meeseeks nodded, as if acknowledging not just the words, but the effort it took to say them. The rest of the family gathered in their own rhythms. Beth, cautious, looked at the creature with clinical curiosity, the way a doctor observes an unusual patient. Summer, with her casual teenage disinterest, still couldn't quite keep her eyes from returning to the Meeseeks. Morty, however, stood closest, as though drawn to a secret only he could hear. Rick sat back in his chair, sipping from a flask that caught the blue glow, his face unreadable. When the Meeseeks spoke again, its voice spread through the room like water seeping into soil. "I live only to help. I fade only when released. Ask and I will serve. Wish and I will listen. My time is yours, until your peace is mine." Its words were simple, yet wrapped in softness, like a blanket draped across weary shoulders. The family listened, half in awe, half in uncertainty. The idea of a being existing only to serve unsettled them, though none could explain why. Perhaps because it mirrored something in themselves, their own quiet wishes, their own unseen burdens. Morty, heart still echoing from the night before, asked carefully, "So, you don't want anything? You don't eat or sleep or—" The Meeseeks shook its head gently. "I want only to be finished. I am joy when you are satisfied. I am freedom when you no longer need me." Its voice carried no sadness, yet Morty felt one bloom in his chest. He thought of people he knew, friends, family, even strangers, who longed for things and rarely found them. So how strange, how beautiful, how heartbreaking that a creature could live for nothing but giving and fade once it had. Jerry, awkwardly clearing his throat, tried to step in. "Well, maybe you could help me with my golf swing?" His words tumbled out nervously, as though he didn't quite believe what he was asking. The Meeseeks nodded eagerly, its smile widening. "Yes, that I can do. Show me." With surprising grace, the blue figure followed Jerry into the backyard. The others watched from the porch, curiosity outweighing skepticism. The Meeseeks studied, the club in Jerry's hands, his posture, the way he twisted his shoulders. Then, in a tone as soft as a teacher helping a child with crayons, it offered guidance. "Loosen here, relax there, trust your rhythm." Jerry swung. The ball soared a little straighter than usual, his eyes lit up with childlike triumph. The eye. Meeseeks clapped lightly, each motion accompanied by a faint shimmer of light, like sparks that left no burn. Beth tilted her head. "It's yet polite," she whispered, as if politeness itself were a rarity. Rick grumbled from behind. "They're designed to be polite. It's in their nature. Don't romanticize it." yet even he couldn't fully dismiss the strange comfort that settled over the yard. For hours the Meeseeks remained patient, adjusting Jerry's swing, repeating encouragements, never once showing frustration. It seemed endless in its kindness, endless in its willingness to stand by him. Yet, even then, a subtle weariness seemed to ripple beneath its glowing skin, like a candle aware of the wick burning down. Summer finally muttered, "It's kind of creepy, but also kind of sweet." She pulled out her phone, half pretending she wasn't recording the scene. Morty sat on the steps, chin in his hands, watching intently. He wasn't thinking of golf or of Jerry's fumbling. He was thinking of the creature's words, freedom in release. He wondered what that felt like. Was it peace, like falling asleep after a long day, or was it something greater, like dissolving into the stars? The sun climbed higher, but the Meeseeks' glow never dimmed. Its presence was constant, unwavering. It was not like Rick's other creations, which often sputtered, malfunctioned, or exploded. This one radiated steadiness, like a lullaby that never ended. At lunch, when the family gathered around the table, the Meeseeks remained outside, humming softly to itself, waiting for Jerry's next attempt. The hum was barely audible, but it carried into the kitchen, weaving itself into the clink of silverware and the quiet chatter. It was not music, but something close, a tune too simple to remember, yet too soothing to ignore. Beth finally broke the silence. "It doesn't eat. It doesn't rest. Doesn't it feel strange? Something existing only until we're satisfied?" Rick answered with a shrug, his voice weary but firm. "Strange is relative. They're made that way. They don't suffer from it." He paused, and though he wouldn't admit it, his gaze lingered on the glowing figure outside. "Not in the way we do anyway." The afternoon passed, and Jerry's swings grew no better. The Meeseeks, ever patient, encouraged him still. "You are closer. You are learning. Each moment matters." Its tone carried no judgment, only kindness. But there was, if one listened closely, the faintest tremor in its voice, the echo of a being that longed to be done. That night, Morty lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The glow of the Meeseeks faint through his window. He thought of how fragile it seemed despite its brightness. He thought of how it asked for nothing, not even gratitude. And he wondered if people too sometimes lived like that, waiting for release, longing for someone to simply say, "You've done enough, you can rest now." The house settled into sleep slowly. The Meeseeks remained outside, glowing, patient, humming. Its form flickered ever so slightly in the cool night air, like a lantern swaying on a distant shore. It was not gone, not yet, but its presence already felt like memory, tender, fragile, fleeting. And as Morty drifted toward sleep, he whispered to himself, barely louder than a breath, "They're beautiful." The glow seemed to pulse in response, as if hearing him. Then the night closed in, wrapping the house in silence once more. It was only the beginning of what the creatures of blue light would teach them. The days in that house often passed like pages read too quickly, hurried, folded and tucked away before anyone noticed the meaning within them. Rick's inventions came and went, flickering through the rooms like sparks of lightning. The others learned to adjust, to endure, to expect the unexpected. But Morty, still caught between childhood and something more uncertain, carried within him a quiet longing that none of them could quite see. It wasn't that he disliked his grandfather's strange adventures. They were wondrous in their own way, full of strange creatures and worlds that hummed like dreams. Yet each time Morty found himself pulled along, stumbling after Rick's shadow, never quite standing where the light fell. His heart ached with a question too simple to ignore. What would it feel like if the adventure were mine? The Meeseeks still lingered in the house, guiding Jerry with patient words that seemed to echo endlessly. But Morty's mind was elsewhere. He watched the blue creature, watched his father's frustration, and felt a pang of recognition. His father too lived in the shadow of others, always seeking to prove himself, always asking for a chance to be seen. Perhaps that was why Jerry had turned to golf, and why Morty now turned to dreams of his own. One evening, as Rick tinkered with wires that sparked faintly in the garage, Morty stood at the doorway, hesitating. He could hear the clatter of tools, the muttering of formulas too complex for him to follow. The smell of oil and metal hung heavy in the air. Rick didn't look up at first, but Morty cleared his throat, his small voice carrying more weight than he realized. "Rick," he began, cautious. Can I pick what we do next time?" Rick's hands froze for the briefest moment. He continued fiddling, though his eyes shifted. "Pick what, like choose an adventure?" "Morty, adventures aren't toys on a shelf you pick from." His tone was dismissive, but Morty caught the hesitation behind it. I don't know. I want to try. I don't want to just follow you all the time. I want to see what happens if I make the choice." His voice cracked, not with anger, but with earnestness. It was not rebellion. It was longing. Rick finally looked up, his gaze sharp but softened by something unspoken. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. The silence stretched. The only sound was the faint buzzing of a fluorescent light overhead. Morty's heart raced, unsure if he had said too much. At last, Rick leaned back in his chair, exhaling a sigh that carried years of weariness. "You really want that, huh?" Morty nodded quickly, almost desperately. "Yeah, I just want to try. Just once." Rick stared at him for a long while. The boy's eyes were wide, not with defiance, but with hope. It was a look Rick hadn't seen in a long time, the same look, perhaps, that he himself had once carried, before time had dulled it. "Fine," Rick muttered at last. "Next time you call it. Whatever dumb sentimental idea you've got in your head, we'll do that." His words were rough, but Morty heard the concession beneath them. A warmth spread through Morty's chest, fragile, yet steady. So it wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was the simple relief of being seen, even for a moment. He whispered, "Thanks, Rick," as though the words themselves might break the spell if spoken too loud. That night, Morty lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling that seemed endless in its stillness. He imagined roads stretching into the distance, paths that had no clear end but shimmered with possibility. He imagined stepping forward without stumbling, imagined choosing the way instead of following. His heart fluttered, not with excitement, but with a tender kind of anticipation, like holding a secret close to the chest. The Meeseeks glow outside his window pulsed faintly, as though echoing his thoughts. Morty wondered if the creature understood wishes, not just tasks but dreams, the kind that weren't easily fulfilled. Did it know the ache of wanting to matter, the ache of wanting a moment to be one's own? Downstairs, Rick sat in the dim light of the kitchen, sipping quietly. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but Morty's words lingered. A request so simple, yet carrying the weight of all unspoken generations. The child wanting to step into the story, the grandson asking not to be left behind. Rick thought of the many adventures, the countless universes, and for the first time in a while, wondered what it might feel like to let someone else steer. When morning came, the house looked the same, dishes left half-washed, shoes scattered near the door, a calendar marked with forgotten reminders. Yet for Morty, something had shifted. The air itself felt lighter, filled with a possibility that hadn't been there before. He watched as the Meeseeks continued patiently with Jerry, their voices drifting through the rooms. But Morty's mind was on the promise made in the garage, a promise that seemed small to others, but to him was everything. It was just a simple wish. Yet sometimes, simple wishes are the ones that change everything. The morning came with no announcement, just the pale wash of light through curtains that had never quite been drawn all the way. Morty woke earlier than usual, not because he had to, but because something inside him stirred with a quiet energy. It wasn't excitement in the loud, thundering sense. It was gentler than that, more like a small lantern flickering in the chest, asking to be carried somewhere unknown. Downstairs, Rick was already in the garage. He always was. The hum of machines and the sharp click of metal echoed faintly through the house. Morty hovered at the doorway for a moment, unsure if last night's words had truly mattered, unsure if Rick even remembered. Rick didn't look up, but without turning, he muttered, "Well?" "You said you wanted to pick, Morty. I'm waiting." Morty blinked, startled that his grandfather had not only remembered, but was offering the space, however begrudgingly. His mouth went dry as he shuffled closer, words tangling in his throat. I don't know exactly, just maybe somewhere different, somewhere that feels like mine." Rick snorted, though not unkindly. "That's not an address, Morty. You can't just say somewhere different. The multiverse is endless. You gotta give me something." Morty hesitated. His mind darted between images he'd imagined the night before. Roads winding endlessly, skies he had never seen, landscapes that felt alive. He closed his eyes and whispered, "A place where the road doesn't end." Rick turned slowly, eyeing him with that mix of skepticism and reluctant curiosity he reserved for moments he couldn't quite predict. "The road doesn't end, huh? Real poetic, Morty. All right, let's see what's out there." With a few swift movements, Rick twisted knobs and pressed buttons on a console Morty couldn't begin to understand. Sparks flickered. A portal swirled open in shimmering green. And there it was, the beginning of Morty's road. The boy's heart fluttered as he stepped closer, the glow painting his skin. He glanced back at Rick, half expecting him to scoff and cancel the whole thing. But Rick only adjusted his flask, muttering, "Well, go on, Morty, you asked for it." Together they stepped through. The air on the other side was cooler, softer. They found themselves standing on a path that stretched farther than the eye could follow. Its stones uneven, but strangely inviting. Fields spread wide on either side, dotted with flowers that swayed as though they were listening. The sky carried two suns, one pale, one golden, overlapping in a way that made the light shimmer like water. Morty's breath caught. It's beautiful." Rick shoved his hands into his pockets. "It's a road. You wanted a road, here it is. Roads always lead somewhere, Morty. That's the trick." But even he seemed slower, more thoughtful than usual, as if the landscape had slipped under his skin despite his resistance. They began to walk. The path crunched softly beneath their feet, each step carrying them further from the familiar and deeper into something dreamlike. The silence between them was not heavy, but companionable, stitched with the quiet hum of wind across the fields. For the first time, Morty wasn't stumbling after Rick. He wasn't rushing to keep up or panicking at every strange sound. He was walking beside him. The difference was subtle, but to Morty it was everything. After a long stretch of silence, Morty spoke, his voice uncertain but hopeful. Do you think maybe I'll figure out who I am out here? On this road?" Rick glanced at him, brow furrowed. The question was too earnest, too raw for him to meet head-on. "Morty, you don't figure that stuff out all at once. It's not like solving an equation. You just walk the road, see where it goes. Sometimes you learn something. Sometimes you don't, but you keep walking." Morty nodded, letting the words settle. He didn't fully understand, but he felt their weight, their quiet truth. As the suns shifted in the sky, casting long shadows across the path, they encountered their first strangeness. Not a monster, not a danger, but a tree. A tree so tall it seemed to pierce the heavens, its bark glowing faintly, its branches humming as though carrying a melody no one had taught them. Morty stepped closer, mesmerized. "It's singing," he whispered. Rick rolled his eyes but stayed quiet. He could hear it, too. The sound was soft, like the memory of a lullaby, and for a moment both of them simply stood there listening. Is this part of it?" Morty asked, unsure if he should touch the trunk. Rick shrugged. "Part of what? The adventure? The road?" "Morty, everything's part of it. Even the boring bits. Especially the boring bits." Morty smiled faintly at that. It was a simple line, but it settled in him like a seed. They continued onward, the tree's song fading into the wind. The road curved, dipped, and rose again, always unfolding just far enough ahead to keep them moving. Morty's legs grew tired, but he didn't complain. The ache felt earned, a reminder that he had chosen this path. As dusk began to fall, though dusk here was stranger, painted with colors Morty had no name for, they found a small clearing beside the road. Rick muttered something about resting, though Morty suspected it was less about his own exhaustion, and more about giving Morty space to breathe. They sat together in the fading light, silence stretching comfortably. The sky shifted, stars beginning to appear one by one, though these stars pulsed in slow rhythms as if alive. Morty leaned back watching them, his heart swelling with quiet wonder. Rick beside him took a long drink from his flask but said nothing. Morty didn't need him to. Just sitting there side by side was enough. The boy's wish had been simple, to choose his own adventure, to walk a road that didn't end. And now here they were, the road unfolding endlessly before them, the promise of tomorrow waiting just beyond the horizon. For the first time, Morty felt not like a passenger, but a traveler. And for the first time, Rick let the silence do the talking. The road stretched on, infinite and dreamlike. And though they could not see where it would lead, both understood in their own quiet ways that the journey itself was enough. The night had been long, yet gentle. Morty drifted in and out of sleep, half aware of the hum of insects he had never heard before, half listening to Rick's faint mutters as the old man tinkered with something in the grass. By the time the twin suns rose again, Morty felt both rested and restless, his heart pushing him forward. The road still stretched ahead, quiet and infinite, waiting for him. They began walking again, the gravel crunching softly beneath their feet. For a while neither spoke. Rick's gaze lingered on the horizon, while Morty's eyes searched the roadside for meaning, for signs, for anything that might reveal why this place mattered. The path wasn't dangerous, it wasn't frightening, but it held a strangeness that tugged at Morty's thoughts, a promise that something was about to be revealed. It came in the form of a small figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, Morty thought it was a child, small, thin, clutching something close to its chest. But as they neared, he saw that it wasn't human at all. Its skin shimmered like liquid glass, translucent and glowing faintly, as though starlight had been poured into a fragile shape. "Rick," Morty whispered, his steps slowing. Rick only grunted. "Yeah, I see it." "Don't freak out, Morty, it's just a thing. Everything's a thing out here." The figure tilted its head, gazing at them with wide, dark eyes. It didn't move, didn't run, just waited. Morty felt a pang of nervousness, but also an inexplicable pull. He stepped closer. The creature lifted its small hands, revealing what it held, a broken wheel. Simple, wooden, ordinary, except for the way it seemed impossibly heavy in its grasp. Morty swallowed hard. I think it needs help," Rick sighed. "Of course it does. That's the story, isn't it? Someone's always needing something." "Go on then, Morty. You're the one who wanted this road." With hesitant steps, Morty approached. The creature didn't speak, but its silence was eloquent. Morty knelt, reaching out, and took the wheel. It was heavier than it looked, rough against his palms. He glanced around and noticed a small cart at the roadside, tipped awkwardly, its axle bare. He understood. Slowly, awkwardly, Morty lifted the wheel and tried to set it back in place. His arms trembled. He wasn't strong and his hands weren't steady. The task seemed simple. Just fix the cart. Yet each attempt slipped. Each effort left him frustrated. Rick leaned lazily against a stone, watching but not interfering. "Well, Morty, gonna give up already?" Morty gritted his teeth. No, It's harder than it looks." The creature stood nearby, still silent, its gaze heavy but patient. There was no judgment in its eyes, only waiting. Morty took a deep breath, adjusted his grip and tried again. This time he slowed down, aligning the wheel carefully, guiding it instead of forcing it. The axle slid into place, a soft click echoed, and suddenly the wheel fit. The creature's body glowed brighter, pulsing gently. It stepped forward, touching Morty's arm for a moment, a brief gesture of gratitude that felt warmer than words. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it climbed into the cart and rolled away down the road, vanishing into the shimmer of distance. Morty stood frozen, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. He hadn't fought a monster. He hadn't saved the world. He had just helped. Rick approached, shaking his head. "You know, Morty, sometimes I think you're too soft for this kind of thing. And then you go and prove me wrong in the smallest way possible. Fixing a wheel, huh? That's your first great trial." Morty smiled faintly, though he didn't respond. Something about the simplicity of it mattered more than Rick's sarcasm. He had struggled, and then he had figured it out. That was enough. They continued walking. The road wound upward now, into gentle hills covered with strange flowers that shifted colors as they passed. At the crest of one hill they encountered another trouble. A stream cut across the road, shallow but swift, its water sparkling like liquid glass. A fallen tree acted as a bridge, but the surface was slick, the crossing uncertain. Morty hesitated. "What if I slip?" Rick raised an eyebrow. "Then you get wet, Morty, that's life. You fall, you get wet. Doesn't kill you." Morty stepped onto the log, his heart hammering. The stream whispered below him, its sound hypnotic. Each step required focus, balance, trust in his own unsteady legs. He almost lost his footing halfway across, arms flailing, but he caught himself and pressed on. When he reached the other side, he exhaled deeply, laughing in disbelief. "I did it. I actually did it." Rick crossed behind him with ease, not even looking down. Yeah, congratulations, you crossed a log. Real hero stuff, Morty. But Morty didn't mind the sarcasm. To him it had been a trial, not of danger but of courage. And each trial, however small, stitched itself into the fabric of his confidence. By evening they reached a valley where the road split into two. One path led into dense woods, dark and whispering. The other curved toward open fields, wide and golden in the fading light. Morty looked to Rick. "Which way?" Rick shrugged. "It's your road, Morty. You choose." Morty studied both paths. The woods frightened him, though something about them also intrigued him. The field seemed easier, safer. He lingered, torn, then finally pointed to the woods. "That way," Rick smirked faintly. "Didn't think you had it in you." "All right then." Into the trees. The woods greeted them with shadows, the air cooler, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Morty felt his nerves rise again, but also a strange thrill. He had chosen this. The road was his in all its uncertainties. As night deepened, they made camp beneath a tree whose branches curled like open hands. Morty lay awake longer than usual, thinking about the wheel, the stream, the choice of paths. None of it had been grand or dramatic. But each moment had felt like a step closer to himself, a step toward the strength he didn't know he had. Rick sat nearby, pretending not to notice, but his eyes softened when he glanced at the boy. For all his cynicism, even he knew that small troubles often carried the truest answers. And so the road continued, winding quietly, each step a lesson, each trial a whisper of growth. At the same hour, Morty drifted into uneasy dreams beneath the curling branches of the forest. Another quiet began to unfold back home. The house was still, the lamps glowing with that fragile evening haze, but there was movement in the kitchen, Jerry pacing, clutching a small iron putter as though it were both weapon and burden. The box rested on the table. Rick's box, left behind almost casually, as if it were no more remarkable than an old lunch pail. Yet even when closed it seemed to hum faintly, a presence that made the air feel charged. Jerry stared at it the way one stares at an unopened letter, afraid of what it might reveal, yet desperate for what it might contain. He touched the button. A soft glow burst forth, and from it stepped a figure of blue light. Its body was tall but soft, cartoonish in its proportions, with a face that wore nothing but eagerness. Its eyes blinked wide, and its voice, when it spoke, was as simple as a child's song. "I'm Mr. Meeseeks. How can I help you?" The sound startled Jerry. He almost dropped the putter. Yet the gentleness of the creature's tone calmed him too, like a lullaby sung by something that had only just learned what singing was. Jerry stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. I need to be better at golf." The Meeseeks tilted its head, smiling. "Okie dokie." Easy peasy. It clapped its hands as though conjuring enthusiasm itself. Jerry blinked. That was it. No judgment, no hesitation, just cheerful promise. Something inside him loosened, a little knot of shame that had been pulling tight all day. The Meeseeks followed him out into the yard, where a patch of grass bore the crude scars of Jerry's many failed attempts. The evening light stretched long shadows across the lawn, soft and forgiving. The Meeseeks studied Jerry's form as he swung the club, missing the ball entirely. It murmured. "Try loosening your shoulders. Don't force it. Swing like you're sighing." Jerry tried again. The ball skittered sideways into a bush. He grimaced. "No problem," the Meeseeks said brightly. "We'll just keep working at it." But Jerry's hands were clumsy, his grip uncertain, his shoulders too tight. Each swing carried not only the weight of the club, but the heaviness of his own insecurities. His failures stacked like quiet stones, and each correction the Meeseeks offered seemed to slide off him like water off glass. Hours passed. The yard grew darker. Jerry's forehead shone with sweat. The Meeseeks' cheer remained, though there was a subtle shift, a twitch at the corner of its smile, a tiny strain in its voice, like a violin string pulled just a touch too tight. "It's okay," it said again, clapping its hands. "We'll get there. We have to get there." For Jerry, the words went unnoticed. He was consumed by his own frustration, swinging again and again, blaming the club, the ground, even the air itself. He didn't notice how the Meeseeks' glow flickered faintly, how its eyes grew wider with each failed attempt. Later, when Beth peeked out the window, she saw her husband and the strange blue figure side by side in the yard. The sight was both comical and unsettling. Jerry slouched, shoulders stiff with determination, while the Meeseeks bounced lightly, encouraging, almost pleading. She didn't step outside. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, and let the curtain fall closed again. By midnight, Jerry was exhausted. His arms ached, his swings sloppy. He slumped into a chair, groaning. "I don't think I'm improving," he muttered. The Meeseeks' voice, though still cheerful, cracked ever so slightly. No, you're improving. I can feel it. Just one more swing, please, just one more." Jerry frowned. The insistence was odd, but he was too tired to argue. He stood, lifted the club again, and swung. The ball rolled a pitiful few inches across the grass. The Meeseeks' hands shook. Its smile faltered. For the first time, its eyes darted away, searching the horizon as though for an answer that would not come. Jerry sighed heavily. "Maybe I'm just hopeless." The Meeseeks stepped forward, gripping Jerry's shoulders with surprising urgency. Its hands were warm, almost trembling. "No, you're not hopeless. You can do this. You must do this. It's the only way I can go." The words lingered in the air, strange and heavy. Jerry blinked at it, confused. "Go? What do you mean?" "Go," the Meeseeks forced a smile, though its glow dimmed. "We exist to help. Once the task is done, we vanish. That's our piece." Jerry opened his mouth to respond, but said nothing. He looked away, suddenly feeling a weight he hadn't expected, the knowledge that his failures didn't just belong to him anymore. They belonged to this glowing creature too. The Meeseeks clapped again, louder than before, the sound echoing too sharply in the quiet yard. "Come on, one more!" "You're so close." Jerry lifted the club again, though his hands shook now for reasons beyond fatigue. He swung, missed, swung again, missed again. Each failure made the Meeseeks' glow flicker, its cheer more frantic, as though stitched together with threads about to snap. From the window, Beth watched again, her hand pressed to her lips. There was something almost heartbreaking about the scene. Her husband, desperate to master something so small, and the glowing creature, desperate for him to succeed, as if both of them were trapped in the same fragile wish. By dawn, Jerry's arms were limp, the lawn littered with golf balls that had rolled nowhere. The Meeseeks stood still beside him, its glow dimmed to a faint shimmer, its smile trembling. "Tomorrow," it whispered softly, almost to itself. "Tomorrow we'll get it right. We have to." Jerry nodded vaguely, too tired to question, too weary to wonder at the sadness in its voice. He stumbled back inside, leaving the creature alone in the yard. The Meeseeks looked up at the sky, its eyes wide, almost pleading with the dawn itself. For all its cheer, there was a quiet ache now, a strain beneath the surface. The wish had been simple, but simplicity, it seemed, was sometimes the heaviest burden of all. And so the Meeseeks waited, glowing faintly in the early morning light, its purpose still unfulfilled. Morning light spilled across the smith's yard, soft and golden, yet heavy with the remnants of a restless night. Jerry shuffled out onto the grass, clutching his putter like a lifeline. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but his pride urged him forward. The first Meeseeks, the one who had stood by him faithfully through every missed swing, waited with an eager smile that trembled at its edges. "Ready, Jerry?" it asked, voice quivering between encouragement and desperation. Jerry sighed, lifted the club and swung. The ball skipped weakly, rolling a few inches before dying in the dew-soaked grass. The Meeseeks' eyes widened. Its glow flickered again. No. That's not it. You have to relax, shoulders down. Just do it right," Jerry tried again. The swing was worse. His arms had grown too heavy for patience. The Meeseeks inhaled sharply as though panicking, then forced a smile. Okay. We can fix this. I'll call another." Before Jerry could ask what it meant, the creature slapped the side of its own head, and another Meeseeks bloomed into existence. "I'm Mr. Meeseeks. How can I help you?" The new one chimed, glowing brightly, voice pure with fresh eagerness. The first pointed urgently at Jerry. "Help him with his golf game. He needs to get better. He has to get better." The second smiled wide, hands on its hips. "Oh, sure." "Easy peasy." Jerry frowned, watching the two creatures circle him. The new one adjusted his grip, tugged at his elbows, repositioned his feet. Jerry swung again, the ball lifting slightly but veering far off course. The first Meeseeks cheered, though its voice cracked. "Closer, that's progress." The second tilted its head. Not enough progress. Let's try something else. And with that a third was summoned. Soon the yard was alive with voices, a chorus of cheerful tones layered with subtle strain. Each new Meeseeks mirrored the first, shimmering in shades of soft blue, each one brimming with determination that grew more frantic with every failed swing. Keep your eye on the ball. Loosen the wrists. Shift your weight forward, Jerry. You can do this. You must do this. Jerry stumbled under the weight of so many commands. His head spun with instructions, his swings wild and sloppy. The balls scattered in every direction. From the window, Beth and Summer watched. Summer stifled a laugh, but Beth felt only unease. The yard, once quiet, now pulsed with a surreal energy. The Meeseeks, glowing bright, seemed almost too desperate in their joy, like candles burning too fast. Hours passed. Jerry grew weaker. The Meeseeks grew louder. Their cheer had sharpened into insistence, their voices overlapping in anxious harmony. What began as a single helper had become a small crowd, all working toward one impossible goal. And still, Jerry could not hit the ball as they wished. By late afternoon, Jerry collapsed onto the grass, panting. I'm just not good at this. Maybe I never will be. A hush fell over the yard. Dozens of glowing faces turned toward him, their smiles twitching, their eyes wide. The silence was worse than their chatter. It carried an almost unbearable pressure, as if the whole world paused, waiting for Jerry to take back what he had said. Then the first Meeseeks spoke, voice trembling. No, Jerry, you will improve. You have to. It's the only way we end. Another echoed, more frantic. Please, Jerry, please just swing better. Jerry groaned, covering his face with his hands. I can't. Don't you get it? I just can't. The Meeseeks recoiled, their glow flickering more violently now. One of them clutched its head. Another wrung its hands, eyes darting as though trapped in an invisible cage. Yet even then, they did not turn against Jerry. Their desperation remained tied to him, tethered by the fragile hope of his success. By evening, the yard looked like a gathering of stars, dozens of Meeseeks swaying gently, murmuring in anxious tones. Their voices overlapped in a soft, eerie chorus. He must succeed. He will succeed. We have to see the end. Jerry lay on the porch, utterly spent. Beth brought him a glass of water, her face tight with worry. She glanced at the sea of glowing figures and whispered, Jerry, what have you done? He shook his head weakly. I just wanted to be better. The Meeseeks pressed closer, not menacing but pleading. Their presence was suffocating. Their joy now stretched so thin it trembled on the edge of despair. One of them knelt before Jerry, eyes wide and shining with both light and sorrow. Please, try again. Just one more time. Jerry lifted the club with shaking hands. He swung. The ball rolled a few feet. A ripple went through the Meeseeks. Their smiles cracked further, their bodies flickering as though they might vanish but didn't. They only stared at Jerry with desperate hope that had nowhere to rest. Night fell. The stars above shimmered, distant echoes of the glowing blue figures below. The yard had become a field of restless lanterns, each flickering, each longing for release, and Jerry, caught in the center, felt the quiet weight of his own wish pressing down heavier than he had ever imagined. The road stretched endlessly before them, a ribbon of pale dirt, winding through fields that shimmered like seas of quiet gold. Morty walked a few steps ahead of Rick, his small shoulders set in determined silence. He had asked for this journey, asked for the chance to lead, to prove himself. But now the stillness pressed heavily against him, as though the world were watching, waiting for him to stumble. Rick trailed behind, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes half-lidded. He said little, only humming now and then or kicking at a stone that bounced lazily down the path. Though he looked bored, Morty could feel his grandfather's presence like a shadow, patient, unspoken, but always there. The first test of the road came in the form of a hill. It was not steep nor long, but the sun had begun to lower, and the weight of the day clung to Morty's legs. He trudged upward, his breath short, and when he reached the top, the sight before him gave him pause. The land dipped into a hollow, and at its center sat a quiet village, though to call it a village was generous. A few small homes of stone and clay leaned tiredly against one another, their chimneys puffing thin threads of smoke into the dimming sky. Yet what caught Morty's eye was not the homes but the faces. The people who stood in the fields turned toward him with expressions both kind and weary. Their eyes held a question, soft and unspoken, as if they were wondering whether this boy, so slight and trembling, could offer them anything at all. Morty swallowed. He stepped forward, his voice unsteady. Hi. I'm here to help." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. A woman approached, her hands clasped together. She was neither young nor old, her face lined with years that seemed more sorrowful than cruel. "We've been waiting," she whispered. "Not for you, perhaps, but for someone. Our well has gone dry. Our crops grow thin. Could you find water for us?" Morty blinked. Water. It sounded simple, almost too simple, but the weight of their eyes pressed on him and he nodded quickly. Yeah, I can do that." Rick raised an eyebrow, his mouth twitching as if to say something, but he remained silent. He let Morty step forward alone. The boy wandered through the hollow, past the cracked stone of the dry well, past the brittle stalks of corn rattling in the faint breeze. He walked until he found himself at the edge of a grove, where the trees leaned close, whispering secrets he could not quite understand. Somewhere inside, he thought, there must be water. He pushed through the branches. The forest was thick, the air damp. His shoes sank into moss, and soon he heard it, a faint trickle, like the laughter of something half-hidden. He followed it, heart quickening, until he saw the stream. It was narrow, shallow, barely more than a ribbon of light across the stones. He knelt, dipped his hands into the water and let it run through his fingers. Cool alive, but so little of it. He wondered how a village could survive on so small a gift. Still he tried. He carried it back in a hollowed gourd, spilling half with every step. The villagers watched as he poured it into the dry well. The water vanished into the dust, leaving no trace. Their faces fell, though they smiled politely, as though to spare him shame. "Thank you," the woman said softly. Morty felt heat rise in his chest, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. "No, wait! I'll get more. I can fix this." He returned to the grove again and again, carrying what little he could. Each trip left him more exhausted, his arms trembling, his breath ragged. Each trip left the well as dry as before. At last he collapsed beside the stream, staring at the thin ribbon of water. Tears burned at his eyes. "I'm not good enough," he whispered. "I thought I could do this, but I'm just a kid." From the shadows, Rick's voice drifted in, calm and almost gentle. "Nobody's asking you to be perfect, Morty. They just asked you to try." Morty turned. His grandfather leaned against a tree, his silhouette softened by the twilight. For once there was no smirk, no cutting remark, just a quiet watching, a patience Morty had never expected. "I want to be enough," Morty said. His voice cracked. "I wanted this to prove something. But I can't even give them water." Rick stepped closer, crouching near the stream. He dipped his hand into the trickle, let the droplets fall back with a soft splash. "Sometimes, Morty, the world doesn't need solutions. It needs presence. You showed up. You carried what you could. That matters more than you think." Morty stared at him, unsure whether to believe it. But in the fading light, those words felt less like wisdom and more like a lullaby, something to soothe the ache inside. They returned to the village empty-handed. Morty bowed his head, muttered an apology, but the villagers surprised him. They did not scold. They did not turn away. They placed their hands over their hearts and whispered, "Thank you, child. You gave us hope." And in that moment, Morty realized hope itself could be water. The night grew heavy, stars blinking awake above them. Morty lay down in the grass outside the village, exhausted, his body sore but his heart beating with a strange new rhythm. It was not victory, not success, but something gentler, a reminder that trying, even when failing, could touch lives in ways unseen. Rick lay a few feet away, his head tilted toward the sky. He said nothing more, but Morty could feel the quiet care in his silence, like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder without needing to touch. The boy closed his eyes, the whispers of the villagers fading into dreams, and the road ahead stretched on, waiting for his next step. The night air was cool, stitched with the faint hum of insects and the sigh of wind moving through tall grass. Morty slept beside the fire they had built, curled on his side, his face softened by dreams. The villagers had given them blankets, rough but warm, and a small basket of bread. He had eaten only a little before sleep claimed him, exhaustion pressing him down like a tide. Rick sat a few feet away, his back against a stone, a flask in his hand. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating the deep lines carved there not only by age, but by years of thinking too much, running too far, and hiding tenderness behind cynicism. His eyes, tired, sharp, unblinking, lingered on Morty. For all his talk, all his bluster, Rick did not move to wake him or prod him. He just sat, sipping slowly, the silence around him settling like a heavy quilt. And in that silence, something softened. Morty stirred once, murmuring in his sleep, his hand twitching as though he were still carrying that gourd of water through the woods. Rick watched, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. "Even in your dreams, you're still trying, huh?" he whispered under his breath. There was no answer, of course, except the crackle of the fire and the slow rhythm of Morty's breathing. But Rick kept speaking, his voice low, as though confessing not to Morty but to the night itself. "You think it's about proving yourself," he murmured. "You think if you do the right quest or fix the right problem, people will finally see you. But you don't get it yet, Morty. People already see you, they just don't say it out loud." The words hung there, half a confession, half a lullaby. Rick tilted his head back, looking at the stars. They burned cold and brilliant, scattered across the black like shards of glass. He felt them staring back at him, reminding him of every choice, every failure. And yet for once their judgment felt far away. Morty shifted again, rolling onto his back. His lips parted and he sighed, not an anxious sound but one of deep rest. Rick's chest tightened, though he would never admit it. He thought of the boy's stubbornness earlier that day, the way Morty had hauled water again and again, even as his arms gave out, even as his face flushed with frustration. It had been foolish, maybe even pointless, and yet Rick found himself strangely proud. Not because Morty had succeeded, he hadn't, but because Morty hadn't quit even when everything seemed useless. "That's the thing," Rick muttered, almost to himself. "You don't quit, that's rare." He took another sip, then set the flask down in the dirt. The fire popped, a spark floating briefly upward before vanishing into the dark. The world felt suspended, as if the night itself had stretched, longer, softer, to give him space to feel things he usually buried. The village was quiet. Doors shut, windows dark, families huddled inside. Only the faintest sounds reached Rick's ears, the rustle of trees, the trickle of the thin stream in the grove, Morty's breathing. It was a lullaby of small noises, and it soothed him more than he would ever admit. He thought about what it meant, bringing Morty along on these journeys. He told himself it was necessity, that Morty needed to learn, or that he himself needed a companion who would listen without question. But in moments like this, when Morty lay there sleeping, vulnerable and unaware, Rick realized it was something gentler. He wanted Morty to see the world, not just the strange and dangerous, but the quiet, the in-between. He wanted him to learn not only survival, but tenderness. Of course, he would never say that aloud. The words would crumble in his throat, turn bitter the moment they left his lips. So instead, he watched. He let the silence carry what he could not. After a while, Rick rose quietly and walked to the edge of the field. The stars stretched wider here, the horizon open. He pulled something from his pocket, a small device no larger than a coin, glowing faintly blue. For a moment, he turned it over in his hand, considering. Then he clicked it off and slipped it back into his coat. "No shortcuts tonight," he muttered. "Let the kid have his dream." When he returned, Morty was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Rick lowered himself back down, tugged his coat tighter around his shoulders, and stared into the fire until the flames blurred. He let his eyes close, not fully sleeping, but resting in the in-between, that quiet place where the world feels gentle, even to the restless. In the hours before dawn, Rick woke briefly to find Morty's blanket had slipped away. Without thinking, he leaned over and pulled it back across the boy's chest. Morty stirred, sighed, and settled deeper into sleep. Rick sat back, his face unreadable in the firelight. He said nothing, but for a moment the faintest echo of a smile touched his lips. The night wore on, and the stars turned slowly overhead. Rick kept his silent watch, not as a scientist, not as a cynic, but as something softer, a grandfather, guarding the dreams of a boy who still believed in him. And when morning came, with its pale light and birdsong, Rick was the first to rise. He kicked at the ashes of the fire, glanced once at Morty, still curled in sleep, and muttered, "Come on, kid." Rhodes waiting. His voice was gruff, but the softness lingered in the silence between his words. The house was quiet when it began. Sunlight pooled in soft patches across the kitchen table, catching the glint of empty glasses, a bowl left unfinished, the faint clutter of a family that had rushed into the day. Yet in the corner, near the strange little box that Rick had left behind, something stirred. A Meeseeks stood there, tall, blue, glowing faintly as though lit from within. Its smile was wide but faltering, its hands clasped as if waiting for instruction. Jerry sat nearby, golf club in his hands, the faintest sheen of sweat already on his forehead. "All right," Jerry muttered, setting his feet. "One more swing." The Meeseeks watched, eyes unblinking, posture eager, like a child desperate to please. Jerry swung, the ball skittered, and the Meeseeks clapped its hands politely, though its voice wavered. "Oh, good try, maybe—" "Loosen your grip, sir. Just a little." Yes, we can do this," Jerry grumbled, adjusted, swung again. The ball rolled a few feet. The Meeseeks' smile quivered. It took a step back, wringing its long fingers together. All right, not bad. Let's keep going." Hours passed in this rhythm, swing, miss, encouragement, sigh. The sun shifted across the sky, and the Meeseeks' glow seemed to dim. Still, it did not stop. It could not stop. That was its nature, to finish the task, to fade away only when it was done, but Jerry did not improve. If anything, his swings grew stiffer, his patience thinner. At one point, he dropped the club entirely, groaning, "This is impossible. I'm never going to get this." The Meeseeks flinched as though struck. No, don't say that," it whispered, its voice trembling like a reed in the wind. "We can do this. You must believe. You must try again, please." There was desperation there, hidden beneath the cheerful cadence, a kind of pleading that sounded less like encouragement, more like prayer. Jerry, too lost in his own frustration, did not notice. Later, as shadows stretched long across the floor, Jerry sighed and muttered, "Maybe I just need another one of you guys." His hand moved toward the box. The Meeseeks froze. Its eyes widened, its smile strained to breaking. No, please, not another," it whispered. But Jerry pressed the button anyway, and with a shimmer a second Meeseeks appeared, bright, new, hopeful. "I'm Mr. Meeseeks. Look at me," it chirped. The first Meeseeks looked away, its hands trembling. Already the air felt heavier, as though the simple wish of improving a golf swing had become something vast. "Endless," Jerry explained again. The second Meeseeks clapped with enthusiasm, and the cycle began anew. More swings, more failures, more encouragements that sounded increasingly hollow. By nightfall, a third Meeseeks had been summoned. Then a fourth. Each one entered the world radiant, hopeful, their voices chiming like bells. But soon enough the bells cracked. Their tones shifted, their movements slowed, and their once bright faces began to waver, like reflections in disturbed water. The kitchen, once an ordinary place of morning meals and late-night tea, was now crowded with tall blue figures. They tried to stand straight, tried to remain cheerful, but there was something weary in their postures. Their smiles were stretched too thin, their voices layered with tremors. One of them sat down heavily at the table, cradling its head in its hands. "It's such a simple task," it whispered. "Why can't he do it?" Another knelt by the window, staring at the fading sky as though searching for release. "We're supposed to be brief," it murmured. "We're supposed to end." Their voices overlapped, not loud but soft and heavy, like a chorus of sighs. Jerry ignored most of it, too caught up in his frustration. He swung, missed, cursed, demanded help. The Meeseeks obeyed, always obeyed because that was their nature. But with every miss, something inside them dimmed, and yet even in their sorrow they remained strangely gentle. None raised a hand, none shouted. Instead, their despair came out in whispers, in soft repetitions of please and almost and try again. It was the kind of sadness that doesn't shatter. It lingers, spreading slowly, quietly, until it fills every corner of the room. By midnight, the kitchen was dim except for their faint glow. Jerry had fallen asleep on the couch, golf club still resting in his hand. The Meeseeks gathered together, a huddle of blue light and trembling voices. "What happens if it never ends?" one asked softly. Another shook its head. "We don't know. We've never—" lasted this long. There was silence then, heavy and thick. They looked at one another, eyes wide, as though realizing for the first time that eternity might be possible, not as a gift, but as a curse. And yet in that silence one of them reached out, laying a hand on another's trembling shoulder. "We'll help each other," it whispered. "We'll endure, together." The others nodded, their smiles weak but genuine for a moment. The night stretched on, filled with their murmurs, half lament, half lullaby. The house slept, Jerry dreaming of swings that always failed, the Meeseeks holding vigil, caught between purpose and despair. They were creatures of brief existence, born to vanish. And yet here they were, waiting, aching, whispering, waiting for release that did not come. The morning came slowly, pale light spilling across the grove where Morty and Rick had rested. The air smelled faintly of dew and soil, and the hush of early birdsong drifted through the branches. Morty sat up, rubbing his eyes, his body heavy with the ache of yesterday's failures. His arms still remembered the endless hauling of water, the sting of slipping, the sound of laughter echoing in his head. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he watched the small stream nearby, the way the water bent around stones, the way it carried fallen leaves without resistance. It did not fight its path. It did not hurry. It simply flowed. Rick sat beside him, gruff as ever, sipping something from a tin cup. He didn't offer advice. He didn't scold. He only raised an eyebrow when Morty finally rose and walked back toward the village. The villagers greeted him with nods, their faces unreadable. They did not jeer nor did they cheer. They simply went about their lives, weaving baskets, carrying wood, whispering to their children. Morty felt small in their quiet presence, but not unwelcome. It was as though they had already accepted him as part of the rhythm, whether he succeeded or not. One elder approached him, her hands rough with years of labor. She placed a piece of fruit in his palm, saying nothing. Morty looked at it, confused, but then nodded softly. He ate it slowly, savoring its sweetness. Something in the act steadied him. That day, when he returned to the challenge of the grove, Morty did not rush. He did not think about proving himself. He simply bent down, lifted the gourd of water and carried it step by step. When he stumbled, he did not curse. He simply paused, steadied his breath, and began again. Rick watched from a distance, silent. His sharp eyes softened, though his mouth remained its usual line of indifference. The hours passed gently. Morty did not succeed in the task, not fully. The water still spilled, the gourd still slipped, but something inside him shifted. Each failure no longer felt like a wound. It felt like part of the path, like stones in the river guiding the current. As dusk neared, Morty sat by the stream once more, dipping his fingers into the cool water. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "It's not about finishing, is it? It's about staying with it." Rick, leaning against a tree nearby, gave the faintest grunt. It could have meant anything, but in Morty's heart it felt like agreement. That night, as the villagers sang softly around their fires, Morty lay under the stars and let their voices wash over him. The songs were not about victory. They were about harvests, about children, about the passing of seasons. Simple things, enduring things. Morty closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he did not dream of being a hero. He dreamed of carrying water, again and again, steady and unhurried until the act itself became enough. The stars above seemed to lean closer, as though listening. Their silence felt like comfort, their glow like patience stretched across the night sky. In that silence, Morty's heart softened. He understood in some small way that strength was not in rushing nor in perfection. It was in showing up again and again, even when the world did not notice. It was in patience. The path wound further than Morty had imagined. Beyond the grove, beyond the quiet rhythm of the village, there stretched a landscape both dreamlike and unsettling. Trees bent in unfamiliar directions, their branches twisting as though reaching for something they could never touch. The air carried a faint shimmer, like heat rising off stone, though the wind itself was cool against his cheeks. Rick walked a few steps behind, hands stuffed into his coat pockets, muttering every so often but never interfering. Morty knew his grandfather watched carefully, but the space between them felt deliberate, like Rick wanted him to carry this part of the road on his own. As dusk fell, the land changed again. The horizon trembled with strange lights, not lanterns, not stars, but something softer, drifting like fireflies across the fields. Morty pressed forward, though unease tugged at his stomach. Each sound seemed louder in the growing dark, the snap of twigs beneath his feet, the whisper of grass brushing his ankles. Then, without warning, he stumbled. The ground had dipped suddenly, a hollow disguised by shadows, and Morty fell forward onto his knees. The gourd of water he carried toppled, spilling across the earth. He pressed his hands to the soil, heart racing. Before he could gather himself, a voice came, gentle, almost musical. "Are you all right?" Morty looked up. A figure stood just ahead, outlined by the faint blue shimmer of drifting lights. It was a girl, perhaps his age, perhaps a little older, her hair catching the glow like strands of silver thread. She knelt beside him without hesitation, lifting the gourd and brushing dirt from its sides. Morty blinked, too startled to speak at first. Then he stammered, Yeah, I'm fine, just tripped." The girl smiled, not laughing at him, only offering the kind of smile that makes the air feel lighter. She handed the gourd back into his trembling hands. "Sometimes the ground shifts when you least expect it," she said softly. "It doesn't mean you've failed. It just means the earth wanted you to pause." Morty stared at her, the words sinking in like water soaking into dry soil. Nobody had said it like that before. They sat together for a while, the silence around them filled with the distant hum of unseen insects. The girl picked up a stone, tossing it lightly from hand to hand. "Where are you going?" she asked. Morty hesitated. I don't know exactly. It's supposed to be my adventure, my chance to prove something. But so far I'm just messing up." The girl tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Maybe it isn't about proving anything. Maybe it's just about walking the road and noticing who walks beside you." Her words felt simple, but they sank deep. Morty's chest loosened, some of the weight he had carried since the beginning easing quietly. Rick cleared his throat from a distance, making no move to interrupt. Morty glanced back at him, then at the girl again. "You think so?" he asked. She nodded, her hair catching the shimmer of the lights again. "I know so. Sometimes kindness is the only thing worth carrying." They rose together, walking side by side as the road curved. The girl didn't speak much after that, but her presence was steady, like the stream he had watched that morning. Each step beside her felt easier, less lonely. When they reached the edge of another village, she stopped. Her eyes lingered on him, a softness there that Morty would remember long after. "This is where I turn back," she whispered. Morty wanted to ask her name, wanted to ask if he would see her again, but something in the way she looked at him made him pause. It was as though she was never meant to stay, only to appear long enough to remind him that even in chaos, gentleness exists. She touched his arm lightly, then stepped away, fading into the shimmer of drifting lights until she was gone. Morty stood in the quiet, clutching the gourd against his chest. He felt no grand triumph, no sudden transformation, only a calm certainty that he was not alone, not even when the path seemed endless. Rick joined him, his expression unreadable. He didn't comment on the encounter, didn't tease or explain. He simply gave Morty a look that almost resembled approval. Then they walked on together into the night, the silence between them gentler than before. Above them, the stars glowed, patient and unhurried. The night had grown still, the kind of stillness that makes every breath sound like a tide washing against the shore. Morty walked beside Rick, their steps quiet on the uneven ground, the gourd swaying lightly against his side. He thought of the girl, her voice, her calmness, the way she had vanished like she had never been there at all. Yet her words lingered, trailing behind his thoughts like a soft echo. Sometimes kindness is the only thing worth carrying. The path narrowed until it led them into a clearing. At its center stood a single wooden post, and upon it a lantern burned. The flame inside glowed steady, not fierce, not weak, just quietly alive. It cast a circle of light across the clearing, touching the edges of grass and earth, but leaving the trees beyond in shadow. Morty stopped, staring at the lantern. It seemed out of place, as though no hand had placed it, but instead it had always been there, a silent witness to travelers who passed this way. Rick paused too, though his expression remained unreadable. He stepped closer, hands still stuffed into his coat, and tilted his head toward the flame. "Huh," he muttered. "Old thing still burns?" Morty frowned. "What is it?" Rick shrugged. "Doesn't matter." Light's light. Somebody lit it once and it stayed, but Morty couldn't look away. Something about the lantern pulled at him, not just the glow, but the way it illuminated his grandfather's face. For a moment, Rick's sharp edges softened. The deep lines around his eyes caught the flicker, and instead of harshness, Morty saw weariness. A kind of tired that wasn't physical. Morty whispered, "You look different in the light." Rick glanced at him, an eyebrow raised. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I don't know," Morty said quickly, shifting his gaze to the flame. "It's just, you don't look like you're trying so hard. You look kind of alone." Silence stretched. Rick didn't respond, didn't bark back, didn't drown Morty in words the way he usually did. He just stood there, shoulders hunched, staring into the glow. The lantern hummed faintly, the glass vibrating with the warmth of the fire inside. Morty stepped closer, his reflection mingling with Rick's in the glass. For the first time, he noticed how alike they looked, not in detail, but in something softer, the same shadow around the eyes, the same weight that came from carrying too much in silence. Morty wanted to say something else, something bigger, but the words tangled. So instead, he lifted his hand toward the lantern, not touching it, just feeling its warmth. Rick cleared his throat, the sound rough. "You're seeing what you want to see, Morty. Don't romanticize me. I'm not what you think." But Morty shook his head. "I don't think you're perfect. I just think you're human." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Rick flinched almost imperceptibly, then exhaled long and slow. They stood there together, both staring at the flame. Neither moved to extinguish it, neither questioned why it burned. It was simply there, offering light without asking anything in return. At last, Morty spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever get tired of pretending you don't care?" Rick didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a flask, turning it over in his hand without opening it. His jaw tightened, then loosened. Finally, he said, "Every damn day." The words were quiet, almost lost in the night, but Morty heard them. And he understood. The lantern flickered as though acknowledging the confession, and the clearing grew warmer for just a moment. Morty stepped closer to his grandfather, not saying anything more, just letting the silence stretch in a way that didn't feel empty anymore. When they left the clearing, the lantern still burned steady as ever, casting light into the spaces they no longer needed. Morty carried the image with him, tucked somewhere deep. The flame wasn't just a lantern. It was a glimpse, a reminder, a truth too easily overlooked, that even the brightest, strangest, harshest people carried shadows, and sometimes, just sometimes, the light revealed them in ways words never could. Rick walked ahead, shoulders set as though the moment had never happened. But Morty saw it now, the quiet beneath the noise, the tenderness hidden in the cracks. And for the first time, he didn't just see his grandfather as the man who pulled him into chaos. He saw him as someone who, like himself, was trying to find his way in the dark. The lantern faded behind them, but the understanding lingered. The kitchen had grown crowded, though not with family. Instead, it brimmed with voices, soft, overlapping, almost melodic in their insistence. The Meeseeks multiplied, each flickering with the faint glow of blue light. Their eyes shone with purpose, but beneath it lay an ache, an exhaustion too fragile to name. Jerry sat slumped at the table, golf club in hand, his face drawn into the tight lines of frustration. "I just don't get it," he muttered for the 20th time, swinging half-heartedly toward an invisible ball. The Meeseeks circled him, encouraging in their peculiar way. Their voices rose and fell like a chorus of wind chimes. "Try again." Mr. Jerry, follow through, relax, focus. Yet with each attempt the failure deepened, and so too did their desperation. More appeared with each passing hour, called forth by the ones who could not complete the task. The kitchen grew brighter, louder, a tide of blue figures spilling into the living room, pressing gently against the edges of ordinary life. But in all that noise, one voice remained quiet. Near the counter stood a Meeseek smaller than the rest. Its glow was softer, less urgent, almost dim. Unlike the others, it did not push Jerry to swing again. It simply watched, its head tilted, its expression strangely tender for a being that existed only to serve. Beth moved past with a sigh, carrying dishes she had no desire to wash, her eyes rolling at the chaos. Summer lingered near the doorway, both curious and wary, watching the swarm of creatures that had overtaken their home. The house itself seemed to hum with the weight of unfulfilled purpose. At last, Jerry dropped the club onto the table, burying his face in his hands. "Maybe I'm just hopeless," he groaned. The smaller Meeseeks stepped forward, its steps careful, like a child moving across creaking floorboards. Its voice was quieter than the rest, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Hopelessness is heavy, Mr. Jerry, but it is not forever." Jerry lifted his head, startled. The other Meeseeks chattered over one another, their instructions endless, but this one continued, steady and calm. "We are not meant to stay. We are meant to finish and fade. Yet even in fading there is beauty. You too are not meant to carry the weight forever. It is enough to try, even if trying feels incomplete." For a moment Jerry stared at the little figure. The words didn't fix his swing, didn't change his grip on the club, but something in his shoulders eased. The room seemed to quiet, if only for a heartbeat. Summer, leaning against the wall, blinked in surprise. Did that one just say something different?" Beth glanced over, frowning, but said nothing. She returned to her chores, though her movement slowed, as if the whisper had reached her too. The soft Meeseek stepped back, its glow flickering. Unlike the others, it didn't strain under the weight of unfinished work. It simply shimmered, fragile and small, as though its purpose was not to fix, but to remind. The larger crowd continued to multiply, their voices rising with growing urgency. Yet this one's quiet tone lingered in the air like a lullaby. Jerry, fumbling to pick up his club again, found himself repeating the words under his breath. Not forever. Enough to try. Outside the evening deepened. Through the window the sky bent toward twilight, clouds glowing faintly with the last touches of light. The house, though crowded and strange, seemed softer beneath the hush of that single voice. As the family drifted into their own corners, Beth in the kitchen, Summer by the stairs, Jerry lost in his clumsy practice, the small Meeseeks shimmered once more, then faded. Not with a pop of relief, but with a sigh, as though it had chosen to go, leaving behind not completion, but a seed of gentleness. The others did not notice its absence. They were too tangled in their instructions, too desperate to fulfill what seemed impossible. But for Jerry, and perhaps for Summer too, that whisper remained, echoing quietly in the mind like a light that did not need to burn bright to be remembered. In another world, far along a winding road, Morty stirred as if he had heard it too. Though miles away, though tangled in his own journey, he paused for a moment, looking at Rick with new eyes. Something unseen had crossed the distance, a reminder that impermanence was not loss, but a kind of gift. And somewhere in the house that still glowed with restless blue, the air felt just a little lighter, as though the whisper had changed the silence itself. The kitchen had become unbearable in its brightness. Blue light shimmered across every surface, 1,000 reflections of anxious eyes and restless voices. The Meeseeks had filled the house, pressed against walls and corners, spilling into hallways like a tide that would not recede. Their chorus was high-pitched and trembling, urging Jerry again and again to swing, to aim, to finish, but Jerry's hands shook as he gripped the golf club. His swing was clumsy, hollow, more despair than effort. Sweat beaded at his forehead and his shoulders sagged. "It's useless," he muttered. "I can't do it. I'll never get it right." The voices rose all around him, a dozen, 100, maybe more. "Focus, follow through. Just relax." Their cries grew almost desperate, the sound of beings born to vanish but trapped in existence. Their cheerfulness had cracked into something brittle, like glass threatening to splinter. And then, in the middle of it, Jerry stopped. He lowered the club. He looked at his own trembling hands, at the pale light bouncing off the kitchen walls, and he laughed, not out of joy but out of something else. A hollow, tired laugh that softened into silence. The Meeseeks fell quiet too. The crowd stilled, as though a collective breath had been drawn and held. Jerry set the club on the table. He whispered, almost to himself, "It doesn't matter if I can play golf. It doesn't matter if I'm perfect at anything. Maybe it's enough that I tried." The words were fragile, but they lingered in the stillness, like a candle refusing to flicker out. A ripple passed through the room. The nearest Meeseeks tilted its head, its wide smile trembling. Then another blinked slowly, as if understanding something unspoken. And then all at once the voices softened into a hush. The smaller Meeseeks, the one that had whispered earlier, was gone, but its echo remained. "It is enough to try. One by one, the creatures began to dissolve. Not in chaos, not in the frantic bursts that usually marked their leaving, but in gentle waves of light. They shimmered softly, their bodies thinning into air, their blue glow rising like morning mist. Each departure carried with it not relief, but release, a sigh of gratitude for being let go. Jerry watched, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling as though he, too, had been holding his breath for too long. Summer, standing nearby, whispered, "They're disappearing." Her voice was half awe, half disbelief. Beth leaned in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. But her eyes glistened faintly in the fading light. The kitchen grew quieter with each vanishing figure. The crowd thinned, the glow dimmed until only a few remained. They looked at Jerry one last time, their voices now soft and reverent. "Thank you," they said in unison, though the words sounded more like a breeze than a phrase, and then they were gone. The silence that followed was not heavy, but light. The house seemed to breathe again. The walls, once glowing with unnatural radiance, settled into the gentle dimness of evening. The air carried no urgency, no echo of demand, only a stillness that felt earned. Jerry sat at the table, his hands folded loosely before him. He stared at the empty space where the Meeseeks had been, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the weight of failure pressing down. Instead, he felt something quieter, a strange, almost childlike relief. Summer crossed the room and placed a hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. The gesture was enough. Beth turned away, her voice steady but softer than usual. "Well," she murmured, "I guess that's over." But even she lingered by the doorway a moment longer, her eyes thoughtful before retreating upstairs. The house held its quiet for a long time. Jerry leaned back, exhaling slowly. The club still lay on the table, but it no longer felt like a burden. It was just an object again, harmless, unimportant. In the distance, beyond the walls of the house, beyond the fading blue glow, the world itself seemed to settle. The sky outside was dark, the stars beginning their quiet work of keeping the night company. And within that stillness, Jerry allowed himself something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of peace, however small. Upstairs, Summer gazed out her window, her mind circling back to the sight of the Meeseeks dissolving one by one. Their whispered thank you seemed to echo through her thoughts, reminding her that even impossible things could find rest if given the chance. The house, once crowded and frantic, had become quiet again. Quiet but changed, and in that quiet, the lesson lingered, not about golf, not about success, but about the simple courage of letting go. The road was long and winding, though in truth it hardly seemed like a road at all. It stretched ahead in soft curves, bending into the horizon like a ribbon laid upon a dream. Morty walked slowly, his steps uneven, while Rick trailed beside him with the weight of unspoken thoughts in his eyes. The world they were leaving behind shimmered faintly in the distance, dissolving into memory even as they looked back. Morty's shoulders slumped. The earlier bravado, the need to prove himself, had worn away under the quiet strain of his journey. His chest ached, not from exertion, but from the heaviness of trying to be more than he felt he was. He glanced at Rick, half expecting a sharp word or a careless laugh. But Rick's gaze was fixed on the horizon, and for once silence held between them like a bridge rather than a barrier. The land around them was neither threatening nor familiar. Rolling fields hummed with an otherworldly glow. Strange plants bent toward them as if listening. A breeze carried scents that Morty could not name, sweet and faintly metallic, like memory dressed in perfume. It should have felt alien, but instead it felt calm, as though the world itself was guiding them home. Rick cleared his throat. "You did okay, Morty." His voice was rough, gruff as always, but softer at the edges. Morty looked up, startled. "Okay?" Rick nodded once, still staring ahead. "Better than I expected. You held your own." The words settled over Morty like a blanket. They weren't glowing praise, but they weren't dismissal either. They carried weight, more precious for their rarity. Morty let them sink into the quiet spaces of his heart, filling a small emptiness that had lingered there too long. They walked on. The road curved beneath the dimming sky, stars beginning to appear like watchful eyes. Morty found himself slowing, not out of weariness, but to let the moment stretch. For once he didn't feel hurried by Rick's impatience or pressed into the pace of chaos. Time itself seemed to move more gently here. They came to a small rise where the land dipped into shadow. Morty stopped, turning to take one last look at the path behind them. It shimmered faintly, threads of light unraveling into the distance. "It feels like it's disappearing," he murmured. Rick glanced back too, his eyes narrowing. "Worlds come and go, Morty. What matters is what you carry out of them." Morty nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. But the words echoed inside him, quiet and steady, like the lingering hum of the road itself. As they descended the hill, the night grew cooler. The stars thickened overhead, and the moon, or something that resembled a moon, drifted pale and slow across the sky. Morty hugged his arms to his chest, his thoughts caught between exhaustion and wonder. Rick, for his part, pulled a flask from his coat and took a small sip, though less than usual. His hand lingered on the cap afterward, as though even he felt the need to hold the silence without drowning it. After a while, Morty spoke again, his voice tentative. "Rick, do you ever think about why you do all this? The portals, the inventions, the running around? I mean, what's it all for?" Rick exhaled, long and low. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the stars, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Sometimes, Morty. Sometimes I think about it, and sometimes I don't. Depends on the night." It wasn't the answer Morty wanted, but it was honest, and honesty had its own comfort. The road narrowed as they moved forward, funneling them toward the soft glow of home in the far distance. Morty could see it now, the faint outline of familiar rooftops, the warm haze of streetlights, the promise of ordinary walls and ordinary rooms. It should have felt dull after the strangeness of their journey, yet it stirred something deeper, relief, maybe even gratitude. They paused at the edge of the fields, where the road bent into the familiar. Morty looked at Rick again, searching for something in his face. Rick caught the glance, grunted softly, then placed a rough hand on Morty's shoulder. Just for a moment. The gesture was brief, almost casual, but Morty felt it like an anchor. The weight of connection, the proof that even in Rick's restless world, bonds still mattered. "Come on," Rick said quietly. "Home's waiting." And together they stepped off the dream road and into the glow of returning. Behind them the strange land dissolved fully, its sounds and lights folding into memory. Ahead the air smelled of ordinary life, the faint tang of the city, the promise of their family waiting inside. Yet something within them had shifted, something that would hum beneath their days even after the road was forgotten. Morty exhaled, long and steady. The journey had been his, and though it hadn't proven what he thought it would, it had shown him something gentler, that even in stumbling, he could still walk forward, and even in silence. He was not alone. The house drew near. The stars lingered above, and the road, though gone, continued to hum within them, like a lullaby carried into the night. The house was close now, its lights glowing faintly against the darkness, but neither Rick nor Morty hurried toward the door. Instead, they stopped just beyond the driveway, where the night pressed close, and the world seemed suspended in its own quiet breath. Morty tilted his head back, gazing at the stars that stretched above them. They burned steady and soft, scattered like memories across the sky. Some pulsed faintly, as if whispering from far away. Others shone clear, unblinking, timeless. He thought of the dream road they had walked, the shimmer that had dissolved behind them, and wondered if it had simply folded into this sky. Rick stood beside him, hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. He said nothing at first, but his gaze was fixed upward as well. The sharpness in his expression seemed dulled, rounded by something quieter, something almost wistful. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint hum of crickets and the distant whir of a passing car. Yet here in this moment the world felt still. Morty shifted on his feet. "It looks different tonight," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he meant the stars or himself. Rick grunted, a low sound, not dismissive but contemplative. "Stars always look different when you come back from somewhere strange." Morty let the words settle. He thought of the trials he had faced, of the moments when fear had pressed too close, of how small and unprepared he had felt. But here under the stars those memories softened, their edges blunted by the steady rhythm of the night. He risked a glance at Rick. His grandfather's face was turned skyward, lined and shadowed in the starlight. For once, he didn't look like a man running from something or chasing after everything. He looked still. "Rick?" Morty asked, hesitating. "Do you ever just stop and look like this?" Rick didn't answer right away. He pulled a flask from his pocket, turned it over in his hand, then slipped it back without taking a drink. His shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. "Sometimes," he said at last. His voice was quieter than usual, almost thoughtful. "Sometimes it's enough just to stand here." Morty nodded, his chest loosening. The stars stretched wider above them, their silence vast and gentle. He imagined they were listening, not judging, simply keeping watch. The two of them stood together, not speaking, not moving. The silence between them wasn't heavy now. It was full, carrying unspoken things. Gratitude, weariness, care that neither of them would name aloud. Morty closed his eyes for a moment. The air was cool against his skin, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw not the trials of the road but the steady glow of the lantern from long ago, the one that had never gone out. It felt as if that light lived in him now, faint but steady, a reminder that even in strange journeys and difficult moments, something lasting remained. When he opened his eyes again, Rick was still staring at the stars, his face unreadable. But Morty thought he saw something in his grandfather's posture, a quiet softening, a pause in the endless motion. The sound of the crickets rose and fell, blending with the hush of the wind through the trees. The night wrapped around them like a blanket, cool and steady. Morty let out a long breath. "I don't think I need to be a hero, Rick. Not like I thought. I just want to be okay with who I am." Rick's gaze flicked down toward him, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's harder than any quest, Morty, but it's worth it." The words lingered, rare and unadorned, and Morty felt them settle deep within him. They stayed there for a while longer, just two figures beneath an infinite sky, the house waiting quietly behind them, the stars keeping their watch above. The world seemed to breathe with them, slow and steady, as though urging them toward rest. Eventually Rick shifted, his voice low. "Come on, let's go in." Morty nodded, though his eyes lingered on the stars one last time. They seemed brighter now, closer somehow, as if they had been listening all along. Together they turned toward the door, carrying the silence with them like a lantern they could not see but could always feel. The night had grown deeper, and though Rick and Morty had gone inside, the silence of the stars seemed to follow them. Morty lay in his bed, the blankets pulled up to his chest, but his mind did not yet drift to sleep. Instead, it lingered in a space between waking and dreaming, where memory bent gently and reshaped itself into something softer than the truth. He thought of the Meeseeks, not in the frantic way they had multiplied, nor the confusion that had weighed them down, but in flashes of blue light, shimmering, delicate, almost like candle flames. He could still hear their voices, high-pitched yet oddly tender, calling out in unison with their peculiar refrain. Once that sound had filled the room with a strange comedy, but now in memory it carried something gentler, like the fading hum of a lullaby. Each Meeseeks had been born with one purpose, a single wish to fulfill, and yet they had carried themselves with kindness. Their eyes had glowed with patience, their smiles strained but earnest. Morty thought of how they had worked so hard, even when the task seemed impossible, as though the effort itself mattered as much as the outcome. In the stillness of his room, Morty imagined them not as creatures of chaos, but as fleeting visitors, sparks of light that appeared only to teach something small, something easy to miss. Their presence lingered like after-images on his eyelids. Rick, sitting downstairs in his chair with a drink untouched at his side, felt the echo too. Though he would never admit it aloud, the blue shapes drifted through his mind, half comic, half sorrowful. He thought of their eagerness, their desperation to complete what they had been asked, and the weight that grew when they could not. For a moment he felt an odd kinship with them, a recognition of that same restless need to fix, to solve, to keep moving, even when the answers never came. The house itself seemed to remember. In the corners of the living room, in the shadows near the ceiling, there was the faint suggestion of blue, not real, not visible, but felt. Like the scent of rain that lingers after a storm, or the warmth of a voice long faded, the Meeseeks' presence was woven into the quiet fabric of the home. Morty shifted under his blankets and whispered to himself, as though speaking to the memory. "I hope you're at peace now." No one answered, of course. But in the silence that followed, he imagined a gentle chorus fading into the night, not frantic, not desperate, just soft, like a breeze brushing through an open window. He thought of one in particular, the way it had looked at Jerry with eyes that seemed tired, but still kind. Morty didn't know why that face returned to him more than the others, but he carried it now, as though the memory itself was asking to be held carefully. In another part of the house, Jerry too sat awake. His hands folded awkwardly in his lap, his golf club leaning against the wall untouched. He had not spoken of the Meeseeks since, but their voices returned to him in moments of quiet. They had tried, truly tried, and it was only in their struggle that he began to understand the burden of asking too much, of demanding perfection where none could exist. Even Jerry, in his fumbling way, felt a weight of gratitude mixed with regret. The night deepened further. Somewhere outside, a branch tapped gently against a window. The sound echoed like a knock, and for the briefest instant, Morty imagined it was the return of one last Meeseeks, come not to serve, but to say goodbye. The image comforted him. In his mind's eye, he saw the figure bowing slightly, smiling softly, then dissolving into the dark like mist. Not tragic, not comic, simply fleeting. Rick finally leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. The glass on the table remained untouched. The ice within it melted down to water. He muttered under his breath, though no one was there to hear. "You did your job." That's more than most of us can say. Upstairs, Morty's breathing slowed. The echoes of blue light swirled around him, not frightening, not sad, just present like stars inside his room. They pulsed gently, rhythmically, until they faded into the rhythm of his dreams, and the house, carrying these quiet remnants, seemed to exhale. Morning did not arrive with a rush. It seeped in slowly, a pale grey light spreading across the curtains in Morty's room. He lay still, eyes half open, the weight of sleep still clinging to him, but his thoughts already circling gently. The echoes of the night before had not left him. The Meeseeks lingered in memory, like small ripples that refused to fade from the surface of a pond. Morty turned onto his side and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about whether he had been brave enough, strong enough, or clever enough. Those thoughts usually came first, buzzing like flies, but now there was a softer voice, quieter than all the rest. It asked nothing of him. It simply sat with him, patient and still. He thought about the way he had insisted on his own adventure, the way he had wanted to prove himself to Rick, to step outside of that long, strange shadow his grandfather cast. Yet as he looked back, what had remained with him wasn't triumph or proof. It was the small, aching details, the way the road had stretched endlessly, the way he had stumbled and gotten up again, the way Rick's eyes had softened in moments when Morty thought no one was watching. It struck him then, lying there in the quiet room, that maybe being himself wasn't about conquering anything. Maybe it wasn't about stepping out of someone else's shadow at all. Perhaps it was about noticing the things that others missed, the hidden tendernesses, the fleeting kindness of strangers, the strange sorrow of creatures who only wanted to be released. Morty breathed in deeply, his chest rising and falling. He didn't feel older, but he felt steadier, as though the ground beneath him had shifted and was holding him differently. Downstairs, the sound of dishes clinking drifted up faintly. His mom moving about the kitchen, his dad muttering to himself, Summer sighing in that long-suffering way of hers. Life went on, and yet Morty knew that inside him something quiet had changed, something no one else would notice unless he told them. And maybe he didn't need to tell them. Some truths were better lived quietly than explained loudly. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat for a while. He remembered how frightened he had been when the Meeseeks multiplied, their voices rising, their desperation growing sharper. And yet now in hindsight, that memory carried a strange tenderness too. They had tried. They had cared. Even in their frenzy, there had been an honesty about them, a purity that Morty couldn't dismiss. They had wanted to fulfill their purpose, and in that effort Morty saw something of himself. He didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be the strongest or the smartest. He just needed to try, to care, to keep moving forward even when things didn't resolve neatly. Rick had once said that nothing mattered. Morty had always found that thought terrifying. like the floor being yanked out from under him. But last night, looking into the stars beside Rick, he felt a different kind of truth. Even if nothing mattered in the grandest cosmic sense, it could still matter to him. And maybe that was enough. The day unfolded slowly. Morty dressed, walked downstairs, and sat at the breakfast table. His family carried on as usual, Jerry fumbling with a spoon, Beth's eyes tired but kind, Summer already scrolling on her phone. No one asked him about the journey. No one mentioned the creatures of blue light. The world had already moved on, and yet Morty carried it inside him. Not loudly, not proudly, but softly, like a secret folded into his chest. As he ate quietly, he noticed Rick glance at him once. Just once. There was no lecture, no joke, no smirk. Just a glance, heavy with unspoken things, and then it was gone. Morty didn't need more than that. Later, walking to school, Morty let the morning air fill his lungs. He listened to the sound of his own footsteps, the faint chatter of other kids, the hum of cars passing by. Everything looked the same, but it all felt touched by something unseen, like the whole world had been gently repainted in softer hues. He thought, maybe this is who I am. Not a hero, not a failure, not someone waiting for Rick to define him. Just a boy learning, awkwardly, slowly, honestly. And maybe that was enough. He stopped for a moment, looked up at the sky, and smiled faintly. He didn't always understand the universe, but he was beginning to understand himself, and for Morty, in that quiet moment, that was all that mattered. Rick was never one to linger in silence unless it was the silence of a laboratory, humming with machines and experiments that no one else could understand. Yet tonight, the house was quiet, the clinking of tools absent, the sharp smell of chemicals replaced by the gentler air of evening. He sat slouched in his chair, a half-empty glass on the table, staring at nothing in particular. To anyone passing by, he might have looked bored, maybe even careless. But beneath the weight of his eyelids, in the faint tilt of his mouth, there was something else, a tenderness so rare it almost disguised itself as fatigue. Morty shuffled past the living room, heading upstairs, and for a brief second, Rick's gaze followed him. He didn't call out, didn't tease him, didn't demand anything. Instead, he let his eyes soften, just enough that the boy, had he turned, might have noticed. But Morty didn't turn. He disappeared up the stairs, leaving Rick in that fragile stillness. Rick leaned back and closed his eyes. He remembered the way Morty had looked at the stars last night, not with hunger or bravado, but with something gentler. A question, maybe, or a quiet plea to belong. It had stirred something in Rick, something he rarely let himself feel. For all his talk of science and meaninglessness, there were moments he couldn't shake. The look on Morty's face when he faltered, the hesitant courage when he stood back up, the way he carried failure like a stone and yet still moved forward. Rick saw all of it, even when he pretended not to. He lifted his glass, swirled what little remained, and let the liquid catch the dim light. It wasn't about the drink. It was about having something to hold in his hand, something to steady him while he admitted truths to himself in silence. He would never say them out loud, not to Morty, not to anyone. But he thought them, and thinking them was dangerous enough. Morty mattered. Not because he was clever, not because he was useful, not because he was blood. He mattered because, in a world Rick had long written off as absurd, Morty still believed in the small, stubborn weight of things. He cared, and in his quiet way that made Rick care too. The old scientist sighed and tilted his head back, staring at the ceiling as though it were another kind of sky. He wondered if Morty knew. Probably not. Maybe it was better that way. Rick's care was not the kind of thing that flourished in the open. It thrived in shadows, in stolen glances, in unspoken gestures. The next morning, Rick was already in the garage when Morty wandered in. Tools lay scattered across the table, wires curling like veins. Sparks flickering as Rick adjusted a device no one else could name. Morty hesitated in the doorway. Rick didn't look up. You sleep okay, kid?" His voice was casual, tossed out like a pebble, but something softer threaded through it. Morty blinked, surprised. Yeah, I guess. Good," Rick grunted, tightening a bolt. "That's good. Don't let your head get too heavy with all this stuff. You'll do fine." Morty frowned slightly, not sure if he'd heard right. There was no sarcasm, no sharp edge. Just words, plain and awkward, like stones being laid carefully in a place that needed shoring up. Rick still didn't look at him. His hands kept moving, sparks jumping, the air buzzing faintly. But Morty felt the weight of those words, the unusual warmth tucked inside them. He nodded quietly and stepped further into the garage. They worked side by side for a while, not talking much, the silence companionable. Every now and then, Rick's gaze flickered toward Morty. Quick, fleeting, gone before it could be caught. But Morty felt it all the same, like a shadow moving with him, steadying him. That night, long after the house had gone still, Rick sat outside on the porch with another glass in his hand. The stars stretched wide above him, indifferent and eternal. He thought about the Meeseeks, about Jerry's stubbornness, about the way everything had nearly unraveled. But mostly he thought about Morty. The boy didn't know how much Rick noticed. He didn't know that every stumble, every small victory, every whispered doubt had carved its way into Rick's heart, and Rick would never say it. He would never admit that, in some quiet corner of his chaotic life, Morty was the anchor that kept him from floating away entirely. He sighed, tipping his glass slightly in salute to the sky. "Don't screw this up, old man," he muttered to himself, the words slipping into the night. "The kid deserves better." Then he leaned back, let the stars blur above him, and allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel the rare, dangerous warmth of care. The house was quieter now. The blue creatures were gone, their echoes dissolved into memory. Yet something of them still hovered in the air, as if their voices had left faint trails behind, like chalk lines on a board wiped clean but never fully erased. Jerry sat at the kitchen table, a golf club resting across his lap, staring at it as though it were a puzzle he could never solve. He had asked too much. That much he knew, even if he couldn't put the feeling into words. The Meeseeks had wanted nothing more than to help, to fulfill their purpose, to vanish in peace. And yet, because of his stubbornness, his fumbling pride, they had multiplied and multiplied, until their bright cheer had turned sharp with sorrow. He could still see their faces if he closed his eyes, smiling but desperate, kind but unraveling. Beth moved around the kitchen quietly, her footsteps soft on the tile. She didn't scold him. She didn't say a word. She simply placed a cup of tea near his elbow and let it be. Jerry looked down at the steam rising from the mug, and for the first time in a long while he felt small, not belittled, not mocked, but simply small, human. Upstairs, Morty leaned on the windowsill, gazing out at the dusk. The road outside glowed faintly in the fading light, and he thought of the journey he had taken, the strange trials, the way he had stumbled and stood again. His heart was quieter now. The lesson of the Meeseeks pressed gently at him, though it was hard to name. Not everything can be solved quickly. Not every problem bends neatly to willpower. Sometimes the act of caring, of trying, of letting go was enough. Rick joined him, standing a step back, his eyes scanning the horizon without comment. Morty waited for a sharp remark, some sarcastic jab, but none came. Instead, Rick just stood there, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "Hey, Rick," Morty said after a while, his voice low. Do you think they were, like, happy? At the end, I mean." Rick took a long breath, scratched the back of his neck. "Happy's a big word, Morty. Too big for things that flicker and fade. But they got what they needed. Sometimes that's enough." Morty nodded slowly, the words sinking into him like stones dropping into still water. He thought of the last Meeseeks he had seen, the way its voice had softened, the way its light had dimmed peacefully at last. It had been relief, not triumph. Release, not conquest. There was something strangely beautiful in that. Downstairs, Jerry finally lifted the golf club and set it aside. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug and sat with himself. He wasn't a better golfer, and maybe he never would be. But the Meeseeks had shown him something he couldn't ignore. His endless pushing, his stubborn pride had caused harm. Not loudly, not with violence, but with a slow ache that grew until it filled the room. He whispered to himself, though no one was there to hear, "I don't need to be perfect." The words tasted strange on his tongue, but they were steadying too. That night, the family drifted into their separate spaces. Summer curled up with her headphones. Beth tended to small things with quiet focus. Jerry sat in stillness, and Morty found himself back on the porch beside Rick. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of grass. Above them, the stars looked as though they might fall if stared at too long. Rick exhaled, the sound rough but tired. "You know, Morty, everyone's got their thing. Problems, flaws, whatever. You try too hard to fix it all and you just make a mess. Sometimes you just gotta let things breathe. Even if it hurts. Morty looked up at him. Is that what you do? Rick chuckled dryly, shaking his head. No, I usually just make a bigger mess, but I know the theory. Morty smiled faintly. For all of Rick's words, the lesson had landed. Not just from his grandfather, but from the strange blue beings who had given everything just to be released. They had shown him that imperfection wasn't failure, and that release was its own kind of grace. The porch grew quiet again, the night stretching around them. Morty leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the air settle on his skin. He felt no need to prove himself, no urge to conquer or shine. He felt instead the slow rhythm of life carrying him forward. Imperfect and unpolished, but real, and in that quiet, Morty understood. The lesson of the Meeseeks was not about golf, not about success, not even about purpose. It was about learning to live with the weight of things unfinished, and finding peace there. The stars burned faintly above, silent witnesses to this small, quiet revelation. The road did not begin or end. It simply stretched, as if it had always been there, waiting in the folds of the night. Morty found himself walking it, without remembering when he had started. Beside him, Rick's footsteps were uneven but steady, the kind of rhythm that belonged more to thought than to motion. The air was cool, scented faintly of rain that had never fallen. The sky above was alive. Stars pulsed not as distant fires, but as breathing things, slow and calm, humming with a music that only arrived when one was very still. Morty tilted his head and listened. The sound was not quite a song, not quite silence, but something between, like the echo of lullabies sung long ago. Before he was old enough to remember, the ground beneath their feet shifted softly, turning from soil to stone, from stone to grass, from grass to sand. None of it startled Morty. Everything flowed into everything else as though the world itself was dreaming. He thought dimly that maybe he was dreaming too. But even in dreams, lessons could linger. Shapes rose along the edges of the road, not houses, not trees, but outlines of memory. The kitchen table, a field of wildflowers, the faint glow of a blue figure bowing before dissolving into the air. Morty reached out once, and his hand passed through a lantern that burned without flame. Its light clung to his skin for a moment before fading, leaving only warmth. Rick walked a step ahead, his silhouette loose and hunched, but Morty noticed the gentleness in his pace. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't dragging Morty along. He was simply present, letting the boy walk at his own rhythm. It felt like a gift, one Rick would never name but always give when it mattered most. They came upon a river that flowed without sound. Its waters gleamed silver, reflecting stars that were not in the sky above. Morty knelt and touched it. The ripples carried his handprint outward. And in those ripples he saw moments. Laughter with Summer, Jerry's stubbornness, Beth's quiet strength, the faces of the Meeseeks flickering like candles in the wind. The images expanded until they dissolved into the current, carried away toward some unseen horizon. "Rick," Morty whispered, "where's it all go?" Rick stood behind him, staring into the water. His voice was rough but low, almost tender. "Everywhere, nowhere, doesn't matter which. What matters is you see it before it goes." Morty thought about that. He let his hand rest on the water until it cooled him, then pulled back, watching droplets fall from his fingers like tiny stars returning home. The road wound on. Sometimes it narrowed to the width of a single step. Sometimes it broadened into a field where no path was visible. Yet somehow they knew which way to walk. Along the way, Morty heard faint voices, not loud, not insistent, but gentle. Whispers of the Meeseeks, fragments of laughter, sighs of relief. They did not call him back. They did not cling. They only reminded him that they had been there, and that their leaving was part of the story too. As the dream road stretched, Morty felt sleep tugging at his thoughts. The edges of his mind softened. The world blurred in kindness. He remembered his own fear, his need to prove himself, the heaviness of stumbling, and he remembered how those burdens had lifted, not with triumph but with patience. Rick glanced at him now and then, though he pretended not to. The boy's shoulders were looser, his face calmer. Rick took in the sight with a quiet pride he would never confess. The road led them to a hill, where the horizon curved gently, painted with colors no sky had ever worn. They sat down together, Morty hugging his knees, Rick leaning back with his arms behind him. The ground hummed faintly, like a lullaby pressed through the earth. Neither spoke for a long time. Words felt too heavy for the softness of this place. Instead, they listened, to the hum of stars, to the sigh of rivers, to the far-off laughter of memories not yet finished. Morty closed his eyes. The dream road pulsed beneath him, reminding him of all that had passed. The glowing box, the blue figures, the wish for adventure, the sorrow of unfulfilled tasks, the relief of letting go. Everything had led him here, to this hill, to this moment of quiet rest. He thought he heard Rick mutter something too low to catch. Maybe it was a curse. Maybe it was care. Maybe it was both, as it often was with Rick. Morty didn't need to know. The sound itself was enough, a thread tying him to the world, keeping him steady as sleep pulled him deeper. The stars brightened, the road faded, the river dissolved. All that remained was the warmth of presence, the simple truth that he was not alone. The dreaming road carried him onward, soft as a cradle, endless as night. The night was not loud. It did not blaze or demand attention. It settled instead, the way a blanket might fall across tired shoulders. The stars above grew softer, no longer burning but glowing like old friends keeping watch. Morty lay back against the hill where the dream road had led him, his eyes half closed, his breath slowing with the rhythm of something larger than himself. Rick sat nearby, his posture careless but his eyes awake. The boy's face in rest reminded him of something he would never say out loud. A memory of being small once, of believing in safety before the world had hardened into edges. He kept these thoughts silent, letting them live in the quiet between stars. The road they had walked was fading now, dissolving into mist. Morty could no longer see where it had begun or where it had carried him. And yet he felt no fear. The fading felt right, like the end of a song that had played long enough. He closed his eyes fully, trusting the silence to hold him. In that space between waking and dreaming, Morty thought of the Meeseeks, bright, brief lives who had appeared with smiles and purpose, only to vanish when their work was complete. He remembered their voices, the way they had multiplied in anxious kindness, and the single whisper that had spoken of impermanence. For the first time, Morty understood. The beauty had been in their shortness, in the way they had taught him that release could be gentler than clinging. Rick reached into his coat pocket, though there was no flask there, no gadget to tinker with. Only his hand fidgeting with nothing at all. He exhaled roughly, a sound halfway between annoyance and tenderness. "You did all right, kid," he muttered, though Morty was too far into sleep to hear. Maybe it was better that way. Some truths lived softer when they weren't caught. The hill grew quiet. Even the stars seemed to lean back, letting the silence fill the space. Morty's breath evened out, his chest rising and falling like the tide of a distant sea. The dream road, the river, the voices, all of it slipped behind him, leaving only rest. Rick stayed awake a little longer. His eyes traced constellations that no science had named, constellations shaped more by memory than by math. He let himself feel, just for a moment, the weight of having guided Morty here, not through brilliance or force, but through presence. That was the hardest thing of all, like staying present. He allowed himself one small, quiet sigh. Somewhere in the distance, an echo of blue light shimmered and dissolved. The Meeseeks, too, had found their peace. Rick lay down at last, not close enough to touch, but close enough to share the same horizon. He closed his eyes, though he did not fully sleep. Instead, he drifted in that half-space where thought and dream blur, where care hides behind roughness, and where love is felt without being spoken. Morty dreamed, but the dream was simple. Not an adventure, not a test, just a steady road stretching forward beneath a gentle sky. His body relaxed further, sinking into the kind of sleep that heals. The world itself seemed to take a breath. The stars hummed, the grass swayed. The air whispered a lullaby older than words. Everything folded inward, everything softened, and with that the tale began to close. Not sharply, not with a conclusion, but with an exhale, the way night always does before dawn arrives. The story had been strange and soft, and a little sad, but it had been enough. A road walked, a lesson whispered, a bond deepened. Nothing more was needed. Morty slept. Rick lingered. The night held them both. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of memory, a faint blue glow flickered once more before fading into peace. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.